and welcome back to Inclusive Design 24 2020, brought to you in partnership with Barclays Access and Adobe, Intopia, Technological, InfoAxia, Intuit, and WebAble. We've got an exciting talk coming up. Alistair, do you want to give us the details?
Sure. Next, we have Manuel Matusovic talking about writing CSS with accessibility in mind. Over to you, Manuel.
Thank you. Hello, Inclusive Design 24. It's such an honor to be part of this event. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great day so far. I've learned a lot of new things, and I hope that you will now learn something new from me. My name is Manuel Matusovic. I'm a front-end developer from Vienna, and I work for the city of Vienna. I'm one of the organizers of the Web Clerks meetup and conference, just like Max, and I maintain html.dev and front-end bookmarks. If you are interested in CSS and HTML and web accessibility, you can follow me on Twitter if you want to. My handle is mmatuzo, that's M-A-T-U-Z-O. About 4 years ago, I began to specialize in web accessibility professionally. I read many articles and books. I started to follow experts, and I also shared my knowledge at meetups and online. And one of the first articles I wrote was titled "Writing CSS with Accessibility in Mind." In this article, I shared the most exciting new things that I've learned about web accessibility and CSS. Now, 3 years have passed, CSS has evolved, I've learned new things, and therefore I've decided to write and talk about writing even more CSS with accessibility in mind. This talk is divided into 4 chapters. The first one is progressive enhancement. There is respecting user preferences, improving accessibility with CSS, and CSS and semantics. Let's get started with the first topic, progressive enhancement. Max talked about progressive enhancement earlier, and I'm going to show you some more things that you can do in order to progressively enhance your websites. I'm a huge fan of progressive enhancement. I strongly believe in this principle because it focuses on content and enhances experiences layer by layer. So instead of loading multiple megabytes of polyfills and compiled JavaScript and CSS workaround onto users, we only give browsers code they can handle without additional help. And this usually results in less JavaScript and CSS, better performance, and happier users. On the web, this means starting with a resilient and strong foundation, which is a well-structured and semantic HTML document. We can enhance it with design. So we add another layer and we can make some visual improvements by using CSS. And if for some reason CSS doesn't load because we are using a browser that doesn't support CSS, or maybe we are the connection is really slow and CSS just doesn't load, it doesn't matter because we have a really strong foundation, which is HTML. And then if it makes sense, we might add another layer, which is JavaScript. We can use JavaScript to improve the experience even more. But we should be cautious with using JavaScript. It can potentially slow down performance, especially on mobile devices. So please really only use JavaScript if you really need it. So what we want is we want HTML to be pretty much the only real dependency on our website, basic HTML. Progressive enhancement is the key to giving more people access to our content by serving code according to the capabilities of the end user's browser and device. And CSS has progressive enhancement at its core, and this is best illustrated by its error handling. When errors occur in CSS, the parser doesn't just stop and throw an error. It just attempts to skip the lines it doesn't understand before returning to parsing as normal. So if I select all divs in a page and I set the color property to white, and I select the CSS is property to amazing and the background property to black, the parser won't throw any errors. It will just skip the lines it doesn't understand and apply a white color to all divs and a black background color. And the parser skips this second line because the CSS property doesn't exist. So it's a mistake that I made purposely, on purpose, of course, but it's a mistake. But errors aren't always mistakes. So for example, a browser like Firefox might interpret a modern CSS property without any issues, while the same property looks like an error in Internet Explorer because Internet Explorer might not understand this property. Here's an example. So here is a photo of a dog from the side, and the dog is looking up, and it's wearing a red party hat with white dots. And there is some text, and the text wraps around the rectangle shape of this image. And this will work in most browsers because I'm using float left here on the image, and float has been around for quite a while. This works, but we can make it more interesting. We can enhance it. We can use the shape outside property and shape margin to add a custom shape on top of the image. Now, this is how this example looks now. You can see that now the text doesn't wrap around the rectangle shape of the image, but it wraps around the custom shape that I've defined. And of course, the shape is now in the shape, this custom shape is in the shape of the dog's head. So it looks like the text wraps around the dog's head and body, which is really cool. And shape outside is pretty new, but it's well supported by most browsers. Legacy Edge or IE 11 or Opera Mini are exceptions, but it's fine. They will see the first version that I just showed you. It works, it's accessible. It's just not as fancy as what most browsers will see. Here's another example. I've built a pretty large website recently, and there are many components in this website, and some of the components are enhanced with JavaScript. And each component works with and without JavaScript. And this is really important because we only ship a minimal amount of JavaScript to legacy browsers, because our assumption is that if you're using a really old browser, you are probably also using a really old device. And we just don't want you to bother with having to download multiple kilobytes of JavaScript and having to parse it. So at some point, we have to differentiate between old and new browsers. And here's how we do it. We add a script block to the head element, and we add the type attribute with the value module to this script element. And this turns this script block into a JavaScript module. Inside the block, we select the HTML element, and we apply a class with the class name JS to the element. And this code will only execute in browsers that support JavaScript modules, because by using the type attribute and the value module, we've turned it into a JavaScript module. As you can see, most browsers support JavaScript modules, and there are some exceptions. So all these browsers that support it will get this JavaScript class on the HTML element, and legacy browsers won't. And here's an example how we use it. I'm showing now a list of headings and descriptions. There are only 2 items here right now, so it's pretty usable, it's fine. But if this list gets longer, it might get hard to use. And we could improve this pattern by turning it into an accordion. An accordion is usually a list of headings, and you can click the heading and it will open the content for each heading. So the first thing we do is we select the content, so the accordion panel, and we hide it using display none, but only if the JavaScript class is present. And then I have to do some things in JavaScript, add custom events and ARIA attributes, and I might even add an icon that shows that I can toggle this heading. And now we have an accordion. In modern browsers and legacy browsers get the not so well optimized, but still accessible list-only version. And what's great about this approach is that we can use ES6 syntax without having to compile our JavaScript with Babel or anything, because all browsers that support JavaScript modules also support ES6 syntax. So this means no JavaScript for legacy browsers and less JavaScript for everyone else. It's a win-win situation, I would say. There is more that I can tell you about progressive enhancement, but I don't have the time for that today. But that's not much of an issue, because I've published an article recently I believe this week or last week, I don't remember anymore, it doesn't matter, recently, and there you will find more examples about progressive enhancement and how to apply it to CSS. Now, before I talk about the next topic, which is respecting user preferences, I have to tell you that I stole this title from Eric Eggerts, who has a talk with the same title. It's on YouTube. I just tweeted it a few seconds ago, or maybe I will tweet it in a few seconds. I don't know how well my tweets are timed, but you can find it on my Twitter account and watch it. It's a great talk. This chapter is about operating systems and browsers and their settings. Operating systems and browsers provide users with all kinds of options to customize their browsing experiences, and it's our job to respect these preferences when we write CSS. There are many things that we have to take care of. I'm going to show you two. The first one is one of the most fundamental things that we have to respect, and this is the font size the user chooses in their browser settings. The default font size for most browsers or in most browsers is 16 pixels, but users can change it in the browser preferences to a lower or higher value. When I say 16 pixels, I mean 16 pixels is the base font size for running text. So if a user sets it to, let's say, 20 pixels, we should make sure that it doesn't get lower than that value. And we can do that by using relative units instead of absolute units. So for example, if I select the body and I set the font size to 18 pixels, this is not great because we are overwriting the user's choice. If the user sets the font size in the browser preferences to 20 pixels and we define 18 pixels in the body, we are overwriting their choice. And this, of course, sucks. I'm showing a screen recording right now, and you can see on the left-hand side of the screen browser settings in Firefox, and on the right-hand side there is a simple paragraph where I've set the font size to 18 pixels. And as I'm changing the font size, nothing happens. I'm switching to 20 pixels to 30 pixels to 40, whatever, it doesn't matter because I've defined the font size of 18 pixels, and this overrides the user's choice. I have to mention that I'm changing the base font size and not the minimum font size, just in case you were wondering. All right, so if we use a relative unit like rem instead, we can still define our preferred font size, but we can do it with respecting user preferences. One rem is relative to the root font size, which, as already mentioned, is 16 pixels in most browsers. So if we want to use rem for font sizes, for example, we have to convert pixels to rem. And here's how this works. We take the target font size, so for example, 18 pixels, and we divide it by the base font size, which is 16 pixels. And the value we get is our rem value. So 18 pixels equals 1.125 rem. And if we now select the body and we set the font size to 1.125 rem, we still see the same paragraph with the same font size rendered in 18 pixels. But now if I change the font size, you can see that the font size in our page grows with the setting the user has made in their browser settings. So much more respectful and much more flexible and just, the proper way of doing it. Another thing I want to talk about today is motion and animation. There are many talks about motion and animation, and also many talks about the prefers reduced motion media feature. I won't talk too much about the basics of animation, but there are just two things that I want to show you, or two things that I want to mention. The first thing is an article that I've read earlier this year. It's titled Accessibility for Vestibular Disorders, How My Temporary Disability Changed My Perspective by Facundo Corradini. And this article blew my mind because it was the first time that I read about the negative side effects of animations by someone who experienced it firsthand. And on top of that, Facundo is a developer, so he also describes which patterns and effects were especially bad and made him feel sick and dizzy. Here's a quote from his article. He says, Really, there are no words to describe just how bad a simple parallax effect, scroll jacking, or even background attachment fixed would make me feel. I would rather jump on one of those 20G centrifuges astronauts use than look at a website with parallax scrolling. So animations on the web aren't just annoying sometimes, but they also may cause nausea, dizziness, and headaches in some users. For people with vestibular disorders, it may even cause pain and make them feel so bad that they have to stop using the computer, needing time to recover. Facundo also describes how distracting animations can be if you're having a hard time focusing by itself. He says, the extreme conscious, focused effort it took to read would make it such that anything moving on the screen would instantly break my focus and force me to start the paragraph all over. And I mean anything. I can highly recommend this article. It's really interesting, and Facundo outlines well how important it is to use animations on the web cautiously. And this brings me to the second point I want to talk about, and that is how we actually apply animation. So what we usually do is we have some kind of animation, for example, a keyframe animation in CSS. Here I have a keyframe animation titled walk, and it moves an item from one screen to the other side of the screen. And then we select an element, for example, an image. We use the animation property and we apply the animation. And then hopefully we use the prefers reduced motion media feature and check if it's set to reduce. This means that the user has a setting in their browser, in their operating system, that tells us that they want reduced motion. And then we remove the animation or we reduce motion. I'm going to show an animation right now for 6 seconds where an item moves from right to left. So if you have no preference for reduced motion, you would see an animation of someone moonwalking from one side of the screen to the other side. And if you have reduced motion set in your browser settings, you will just see an animation of someone moonwalking in place. You could even take this one step further and use a combination of the picture element in HTML with prefers reduced motion and switch the GIF with a static JPEG if the user prefers to only get reduced motion. But you don't have to remove animations completely. You can just reduce it. And all you have to do is to determine the most appropriate reduced motion condition for potentially triggering effects. Valhat published an article a few days ago where she explains all kinds of things about motion on the web and what we have to take care of. And she also provides some examples how you can reduce motion instead of removing it. It's online on Smashing Mag, and I also just tweeted the link to this article. So in summary, what we usually do is we select items, we apply some animations or transitions, and then we use the prefers reduced motion media feature. We check if it's set to reduce, and then we use, for example, the universal selector and remove everything. So this is usually what you will find in articles and talks that people recommend doing. Now, the problem with this approach is that the prefers reduced motion media feature was only introduced a few years ago. So users of legacy browsers will see animations no matter what if you write it that way, because we first add animations and then if the user has this preference, we remove it. But if the browser doesn't understand the media feature, it will get animations no matter what. And this is why Patrick H. Lauke recommends a defensive prefers reduced motion use, where animations only run in browsers that support the media feature and only if they have not expressed a preference. So you first check if the browser has no preference. So instead of checking prefers reduced motion reduce, you check for prefers reduced motion, no preference, and only then you add animations. This means by default, we start with no animations and then we progressively enhance it with animations if the user has no preference and if the browser supports the reduced motion media feature. Here's an example how I'm using it on a website. So I'm checking for the I'm using the prefers reduced motion media feature to check if no preference, if the user has no preference. And then I select the HTML element and I set the scroll behavior to smooth. And here's an example. So here's a list of links, of anchor links, and the list is followed by several headings and paragraphs. And if I click one of the links, you can see how the page scrolls smoothly to each anchor. So by clicking a link, you see a scrolling animation. Now, if I open the preferences on macOS, for example, and I select accessibility, display, and I check reduce motion, you can now see that if I click a link, it brings me directly to the anchor without any animation. And this is what you will get if you set reduce motion or if your browser doesn't support the media feature. And that's pretty cool because it's way more respectful and sensitive towards users. That's it for the second chapter. Of course, there's again more that I can tell you, but not today. I will publish the second part of this series of articles soonish. I'm on vacation for 2 weeks, but after that I will publish it and I will show you some more examples of things that we should take care of. The next topic is about CSS and selectors. CSS and its range of selectors provide us with many different ways of improving interfaces and also testing the quality of our interfaces. And the following examples don't just serve as snippets that you can copy and paste to your existing CSS. I mean, you can do that, but they're also intended to inspire you to take advantage of CSS and all the variety of selectors and functions and modern properties that it offers. The first subchapter here is about attribute selectors, because I'm a huge fan of attribute selectors. They're very flexible. You can do all kinds of things with them. Here's an example. Let's say we have a link and the link text is our menu, and this link points to an HTML file. And then we have another link with the same link text, our menu, but now this time it points to a PDF and it has a download attribute. Visually, they look absolutely the same. There's no difference. But if a user clicks the first link, it navigates to a new page. And if the user clicks the second page, it will show a download dialog. And this might be confusing because users might not expect a downloads dialog to pop up when they click a link. Now we can improve this link. We could somehow visually at least show that this is a download link. And we can achieve this by using an attribute selector and select all links with the download attribute. And then we use the after pseudo element and we add an icon next to the links text. So you can see that the first link still looks the same. And the second link now shows a nice download icon next to the link. This is great because now we have a visual difference, but there are at least two issues with this approach. The first one is users might not understand the purpose of the icon. I don't know how to fix this. I guess you will have to do some user testing and see if people understand what this icon means. And the second issue is that this icon will not be announced by screen readers because it's not accessible. It's just a background image. So we should try and fix that. There are different approaches. One is, and the most straightforward, is to just add text that tells users that this is a download link, but there are other ways. Scott Winkle published an article called Tips on Making Sure Hidden Content is Accessible or Not. And there he shares a technique that he uses. And he likes to create a so-called screen reader sprite sheet. This is basically just a hidden div, and this div contains several messages, and each message is wrapped in a span and has an ID. So if you have a link in your page, you can reference one of the messages if it makes sense. Here's an example. Here we have a link. It links to Michelle Barker's website. And if we use a screen reader, it might announce something like Michelle Barker's website link. We can improve that. We can use the ARIA described by attribute and point to one of the messages. And now a screen reader might announce something like Michelle Barker's website opens an external site. It tells more about the purpose of the link. Of course, again, you will have to test with users. You don't want to use too much information here. Yeah, I guess that's something that needs testing, but it's a nice way of improving links. The problem here, if this is the only thing you do, we again have a difference for screen reader users, but no visual difference. So we can use attribute selectors again to also differentiate here visually. One way of styling links differently is to use the ARIA described by attribute in our attribute selector and check if it has a specific value, because all our messages use IDs, so they are unique, and we know that behind the new window 1 ID is a specific message, and then we can add an icon. If you don't want to do that for some reason, we can use another attribute selector. I think they're called substring matching attribute selectors. And here I'm checking if the value of an href attribute on links starts with http:// or https://. If this is true, we add an icon that tells users that this is an external link, for example. Another thing we can do with CSS is testing, and this is really cool. I really like this chapter. We have a file in our development environment at work that's called aletests.css, and it contains a collection of utility classes. For example, this one. We add this class to our HTML element if we want to test our sites with the keyboard only. What this class does is it removes the cursor, it sets cursor to none, and it sets pointer events to none. And we use this because we want to make it as hard as possible to use the mouse when we test with the keyboard, because sometimes as a mouse user, you are tempted to quickly just use the trackpad or the mouse to move focus and keep testing. But if there's no cursor and pointer events don't work, you can't use a mouse. So this is a way to make testing a bit more realistic for us. Another testing class we use is this one. If we add this to the HTML element, again, it turns the website into grayscale mode. And we are using the filter property, and we are setting grayscale to 100%. And here's how the inclusive design 24 website looks like. It's all in gray, just in gray shades of gray. And we use this to check if there are items in our page that convey information with color only. So for example, if we would have links that have no text decoration, no underline, and only are only visually different compared to normal text by color, we would see that we don't see anything. So we will see that there is no difference between links and text. Yeah, that being said, please underline your links. We've heard about debugging accessibility earlier today. Sarah had this fantastic talk. Check it out. It's on YouTube, of course, already, where she explains how to properly debug accessibility. But I also have a way of debugging accessibility, and this is by adding another CSS file to our development environment. And you could save this file as debugging CSS, for example, and it contains some selectors that check several things on our sites. Of course, this is not a replacement, just like the testing file, for tools like X or Wave, but I like to have tests like these in my development environment because I don't have to run any tool and I don't have to switch browser, and I get immediate feedback while I'm working. Here are some examples. For example, I use this combination of selectors to check if there is a language attribute in my document on the HTML element. The language attribute is really important because it defines the natural language on a page, and this might instruct screen readers to use a certain voice profile based on the language. So there are 4 selectors. We first check, is there a language attribute? If not, if it's missing, we show a 10-pixel red border around the HTML element. Then we check if the HTML element contains an empty string or if it's completely empty. or actually if it contains a space or if it's completely empty. And in the last test, we check if it's not set to English. And this is important, especially for non-English people, because usually the websites I build are in German. So the language attribute is set to DE. And if I create a new document in VS Code, for example, and I use a boilerplate, or I use, I don't know, Emmet, for example, to create the structure, usually there is already a language attribute and it's pre-filled with EN. So in audits I do, I often see German pages with the language set to EN because developers simply forget to switch it to DE. So if I would check a German website, I would add this code and just change EN to DE, and it will check if the language attribute is correct. And I'm using the language pseudo class here instead of the of an attribute selector, because the great thing about the language pseudo class is that it doesn't just check if it's set to EN, but this test also includes ENGB and ENUS, so variations of the language. Another thing you can do with this combination of selectors, of course, is to check if images have alt attributes, or if the alt attribute contains a empty space. Here's another test. I'm a huge fan of this test. I know it's not bulletproof, but it's good enough to catch low-hanging fruits. So what I'm doing here is I'm selecting all items with the class BTN or with the class button, quite popular classes for buttons, actual buttons and wannabe buttons. And then I'm using the not selected to check if this item with this class is an actual button. If it's not a button, I show a red outline around the button. Then I check if it's a type button or type submit, or actually if it's not type button and not type submit, and then I show a red border. So this is my way of identifying div or span buttons. This could be extended. So if you know of any other popular button class, you can add it. And of course, you can also extend it by checking if the type is not image or a reset, which are also valid buttons. Another interesting thing we do is we select all items with the tab index attribute. And if the tab value of the tab index attribute is not 0 or -1, we show an orange outline. It's orange because, you know, having a tab index higher than 0 is not an actual error, but it's a bad practice. So we identify this by using this selector. And one more example, I select all buttons that are nested in links and all links nested in buttons. And then again, I show a border, a red border. Now you might think, why in the name of Sir Tim Berners-Lee would anyone put links in a button? I don't know, but the devs are pretty creative. And in order to prove that, I launched this website called HTML. It's on html.dev. And there we collect real life bad practices in HTML. We publish it, of course, without shaming or blaming anyone. So it's anonymous. And we take this code, we explain why it's bad, and we also offer alternative solutions that are more accessible. Of course, this is open source, it's on GitHub. If you want to contribute, please check it out on GitHub, fork the repository, or if forking and coding is not your thing, you can just get in touch with me and we'll do it together and add some more examples for people to learn HTML. If you're interested in testing user interfaces and debugging, there's a project on GitHub I can recommend. It's called Alex, LECSS, and it contains way smarter tests than the tests that I show you and way more tests. It's really great. You can spend the whole day just learning about CSS and accessibility by going through the Sass files in this repository. All right, the last chapter for today is called CSS and semantics. I guess we all know that semantic HTML is important. One reason is that screen readers announce elements differently according to the role of an element and attributes and so on. And this helps screen reader users understand interfaces better. So for example, a div is not just as good as a button. There's a huge difference. Don't use div as buttons, use the button elements. And I assumed that the only language that affects semantics is HTML, but I was proven wrong. Apparently, CSS might also affect semantics, or at least change the way screen readers announce text. Here's some examples. So I'm in Chrome here. There is a list, an unordered list, and I'm inspecting it. And I'm selecting the list. I'm switching to the accessibility pane in Chrome DevTools. And you can see that the role of the list is list, and it contains some child items with the role list item. Now I switch back to the styles pane. I set display to contents. I switch back to the accessibility pane. And you can see now that the list isn't exposed anymore to the accessibility tree. It has been removed from the accessibility tree just because I set display to contents. And that's due to a bug that removes items from the accessibility tree if you use this property. Unfortunately, this bug is still present in Chrome. Display contents is really cool. You can use it for CSS resets or as a replacement for subgrids sometimes. I would love to use it, but as of now, don't use it. It's garbage just because there's this bug in Chrome. So it just renders lists or whatever items inaccessible. Don't use it for now. We'll have to wait some more. I don't know how long, but we'll see. Okay, another example, here's a table with 3 rows. It's a very basic table. I know there should be a T head and a T body and summary and so on, but I didn't have enough space on this slide. So here's a basic table with 3 rows, some heading cells, name, age, and location, and 2 rows with the values Sandra, 24, Austria, and Mike, 42, USA. And I'm in Firefox now. I'm using the NVDA browser, and I have 2 versions of this table. The first one is untouched. I just added some borders so you can see this, the cells. And the second table is not untouched. I've changed 1 line of CSS there. Now let's see what NVDA announces. I hope that you can hear it.
Table demo heading level 1. Default heading level 2. Table with 3 rows and 3 columns. Row 1, column 1 name. Column 2 age. Column 3 location. Row 2 Austria. Row 3 USA. Age column 2 42. Display. Flex heading level 2. Table with 1 rows and 1 columns. Row 1 column 1 name. Edge of table. Edge of table. Edge of table. Edge of table.
So in the first table, NVDA announced table with 3 rows and 3 columns, which is right. This is fine. And then I used the arrow keys to jump from one cell to another, and it worked perfectly fine. In the second table, NVDA announced table 1 row and 1 column for some reason. And when I tried to use the arrow keys, it said edge of table. And the only difference between the first table and the second table is this. I've selected the table rows and I set display to flex. So flex doesn't just change the layout, but it also alters the accessibility information. And it does that at least in NVDA in Firefox, not in Chrome. I think in Chrome it's fine, but it does that in Firefox. And this is not specific to Flexbox. It's about using display. If you want to find out more about this topic, about tables and the display property and the semantics, I can recommend this article by Adrian Roselli. It's titled Tables, CSS, Display Properties, and ARIA. Check it out. He also constantly updates the article. So if something changes in a browser or in a screen reader, you will find it out on Adrian's website. If you don't know Adrian and his blog, check it out, read everything. It might take a while, but you will learn a lot. Basically, not all, but most of the stuff I know about web accessibility is based on this blog and this guy and his talk. So check it out. Here's another example. Here we have a simple unordered list, and I'm using VoiceOver on Safari to read it, to announce it.
List 3 items. Bullet, element 1, bullet, element 2, tick bullet, element 3, 3 of 3, end of list.
So you can hear that VoiceOver tells me that it's a list of 3 items, and for each item it announces the label, and also 1 of 3, 2 of 3, and so on. Now let's see what happens if I select the list and I set the list style type property to none.
Element 1, element 2, element 3.
Now VoiceOver doesn't announce anymore that it's a list and how many items it contains. It just announces the labels. And this is not a bug, it's a feature, because at some point developers decided that everything can be a list, because anything can be a list. And I also did that back in the days. Everything was a list, and the developers of Safari and VoiceOver refer to this as listitis, so like a list disease, something like that. And they thought that if you remove the visible indication of the lists, there is no indication for sighted users, and it also shouldn't be for users of screen readers. And it kind of makes sense. If you want to read more about this topic, and also if you want to find out how to bring accessible information back, even if you're using list style type none, check out Fixing Lists by Scott O'Hara. I mentioned earlier that most of the stuff I've learned from Aidan Roselli, and most of the other stuff I've learned from Scott O'Hara. So please also check out his blog. All right, that's almost it. This is the last example for the day. Here I'm on an iPhone, I'm using iOS, and there is an absolutely arbitrary number, and I'm using VoiceOver to announce it.
8,675,309. 8675309.
So the first number was announced as 8,675,309, and the second number was announced as 8,675,309. And the difference between the first and the second number is that on the second number, I was using the speak as property and I set it to digits. And the speak as property instructs screen readers to pronounce words or numbers differently. This sounds smart and interesting, but don't use speak as. Support sucks. Results are really unpredictable. It took me ages to record this demo, and you really don't want to outsmart screen reader users and also their settings. You probably want to leave this untouched. That's it. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you've learned something new. CSS is a beautiful language, it's powerful. Take advantage, use as many features as possible, use modern CSS, create amazing experiences, but just make sure that you do it with accessibility in mind. Thank you so much.
Good one. Manuel, thank you again for a great talk. As always, I have some things that I need to say. Oh no, I just got to say thanks, and that was a great talk. Do we have any questions, Alistair?
Yeah, we didn't have too many questions. Lots of people saying it's a great talk and thank you. A couple of people were asking whether some of the snippets you used, I think particularly the sort of debugging snippets, are available anywhere. I know you've been live tweeting. Was that one of them?
Yes, I think you will find them in the Elix project that Elix CSS. You will find some of these snippets there, and I can also share CodePens with these snippets. Or actually, I've shared it last week, I think, on my Twitter account. I can reshare it, the specific ones. But everything else you will find in this Elix CSS project in GitHub.
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah, thank you. And a couple of other sort of general questions. I was wondering if you had much success working with people who use a content management system and sort of integrating some of those debugging type features for people contributing content, or was it more focused on the developers?
This specifically was more focused on developers. So we use it in our development environment, but I guess some of the tests would make sense to also include for specific roles of content management systems. I guess that's something that you could do. That would make sense, yeah. But
Yeah.
I haven't tried it myself, no.
I keep recommending it whenever I do training, but so far no one seems to have implemented it. So another sort of general question, you started off with progressive enhancement. So I'm also a big fan, but there are a lot of very JavaScript dependent sites at the moment. I was wondering, is it still as important to consider the kind of CSS aspects of progressive enhancement if a site has pretty much said from a JavaScript point of view, we're not going to be progressively enhanced? Does the CSS bit still matter?
I think it does. You mean specifically for websites that use JavaScript frameworks, or for any website?
Yeah, so things like React, Vue, Angular, those kind of sites.
So if CSS matters, I mean, it depends how these websites are built and how CSS is integrated into the website, I guess. But what I see often when I'm on vacation, for example, is that if I try to access a website and the content makes it over the wire, if I'm on a really slow connection, I'm fine with HTML because sometimes it takes ages just for CSS to load. Of course, on a JavaScript website, I will probably see nothing for quite a while because the JavaScript needs to load and parse. So if you ask me, it still matters to have this strong HTML foundation that works, and CSS is just another layer. Of course, on a JavaScript, a website that's built with a JavaScript framework, probably you first have to load the JavaScript and then the CSS will show. So there, I guess it doesn't matter if this, I don't know if this answers the question.
Yeah, it's yeah, sort of. A lot of your examples, like the prefers reduced motion, I think are still perfectly relevant. That's all good. Steve, did you have a question?
Yeah, I do actually. I was just thinking about the example of the scrolling when you select a link and then it scrolls down, an in-page link. That when you've got reduced motion turned on, it removes that smooth scrolling and makes it look jumpier. So it seems like it seems like to have the opposite effect. I mean, a smooth scroll seems to be a nicer thing for reduced motion than a quick jump.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm not sure. I think that's also something that needs testing, especially in different browsers, because depending on the distance the link has to, or the anchor has to make on the page, scrolling could be faster or slower. So that's one factor you would have to test. And the other thing is, I don't know what people prefer. I guess that needs some testing. But I also like the smooth scrolling animation more than just this quick jump to the link. But I don't know. I guess it needs testing. That's something that you would test with users.
Sure, that was just a personal observation. So with the prefers reduced motion, does that all of those effects, those motion effects, like you can't pick and choose? Like I couldn't, reduce motion on a number of things, but then leave that smooth scrolling, for example. Is that possible with these media queries?
Oh yeah, of course. In some examples, you will see people just use the universal selector and select all items and remove animations and transitions, or you just select a specific item and remove it or reduce it. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. That makes it.
Thank you.
Makes it clearer.
I've had a few discussions with people with vestibular disorders, and although the jumpy aspect might not look as good because it's not a sort of a motion or a simulated motion, sometimes that's not as big an issue as when you have things like parallax going on, which might be very smooth, but because of that simulated motion, that's what the trigger tends to be.
Gotcha.
Yeah, how are we doing for time, Steve?
It's 11 minutes to 10 to.
Okay, it's probably a good time to wrap up then, in which case I'll say thank you very much, Manuel.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Manuel. Great talk. And I'm sure that that the slides will be available if they're not or are not already, and your presentation will be made available on YouTube and captioned in double quick time. So thanks again. Now, if you like this session or any session, hit that YouTube like button. I mean, hit it with your big toe if you're so inclined. I was thinking about it actually. And don't forget, you can subscribe to youtube.com//inclusive design 24 to be kept in the loop on our future events. A reminder that Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you with thanks to Barclay Access, Adobe, and Intopia. Wonderful people that they are. And that wraps up this current session. We'll be back on the hour. Alistair, do you know who's up next?
Pan desperately looking. It is Charlie Turrell and Gareth Ford Williams.
Oh, that's right. It's Gareth and Charlie. Well, I'm sure that's going to be an interesting talk. This is the end of my my time, and I think your time sitting in the hot seats that are the co-host seats. And up next, the baton is being handed over to Joe Franchetti and Adrian Rosselli, the one and only. Thank you, and see you soon.